Crusader Kings III. Most strategy games ask you to conquer the map. This one asks you to manage the crushing stress of ruling while your ambitious cousin tries to poison your heir. The genius here is the personality system, where acting against your ruler's traits literally drives them to an early grave. You might spend 3 hours orchestrating a marriage alliance, only for your new spouse to immediately start a faction against you. It has a notoriously steep learning curve, but seeing the price crash from $50 down to $14.99 makes this the perfect time to risk tearing a medieval dynasty apart. Total War Warhammer III. The sheer scale of the Immortal Empires campaign borders on absurd. You are looking at a digital continent packed with distinct factions, unique corruption mechanics, and monstrous units that completely ignore traditional battlefield tactics. Firing a barrage of Hellstorm rockets into a charging line of demonic infantry never really gets old. Performance can occasionally chug when the unit counts get astronomical, but grabbing a $60 juggernaut for $8.99 is honestly one of the smartest purchases you can make during this entire event. The sheer hours per dollar ratio here is staggering. Hearts of Iron IV. Victory here isn't about clicking the enemy faster. It is entirely about making sure your frontline troops actually have boots, bullets, and a functioning railway behind them. The supply system will completely ruin your grand offensive if you aren't paying attention to the weather and infrastructure. It demands patience and a willingness to stare at logistics screens, but the alternate history scenarios players cook up are legendary. Seeing this drop to under $10 removes pretty much all the risk for anyone wanting to rewrite modern history from a spreadsheet. Age of Empires 4 Anniversary Edition. The asymmetrical civilization design fundamentally changes how you approach a classic formula. Playing the Mongols, who can literally pack up their entire base and move it across the map, feels completely different from turtling behind heavy English stone walls. The stealth forests alone create opportunities for devastating ambushes that can flip a multiplayer match in seconds. The unlockable live-action historical documentaries tied to the campaign add a bizarrely high level of production value. Dropping from $40 down to $13.99 puts this highly polished experience firmly in the impulse buy territory. Call to Arms, Gates of Hell, Ostfront. Taking direct third-person control of a single machine gunner while your larger offensive collapses around you creates a terrifyingly intimate perspective on warfare. The physics engine models armor penetration and dynamic destruction with an obsessive level of detail. A single well-placed artillery shell can permanently alter the terrain, creating craters your infantry will desperately use for cover minutes later. It carries plenty of Eurojank, and the pathfinding sometimes struggles in tight urban areas, but picking up this level of tactical granularity for $8.74 feels almost like stealing. Farthest Frontier. Your biggest enemy isn't an opposing army, it is crop rot and dysentery. Managing the soil fertility of your farms through complex crop rotations is just as critical as building walls to keep out raiders. It captures the brutal reality of survival city building, where one bad winter can cause a death spiral you spend hours trying to recover from. Late-game optimization can tax older processors heavily when your population explodes. Still, for $16.99, the obsessive town management loop easily justifies carving out a massive chunk of your weekend. The Riftbreaker. Fusing a twin-stick action RPG with deep factory automation creates a frantic gameplay loop. You are constantly bouncing between constructing complex energy grids and physically wading into massive swarms of hostile alien wildlife with a nuclear rocket launcher. The moment your defensive perimeter gets breached and you have to abandon base building to furiously repair walls under heavy fire is pure adrenaline. Snagging a game that reliably triggers this much dopamine for under $9 is a massive win for your Steam wallet. Anno 1800.
satisfying a population's bizarrely specific demands for pocket watches and canned goulash requires establishing massive inter-island trade routes. The moment you realize your entire economy is collapsing because a single ship carrying rum got delayed is when the logistics hook sinks in. The sheer density of the production chains will take over your brain, leading to those classic sessions where the sun comes up before you realize what happened. At $14.99, the base game offers more than enough corporate imperialism to keep you occupied for months before even glancing at the DLC. WARNO. Line of sight is everything. Placing a recon unit in the right church tower can feed coordinates to your artillery, completely dismantling an enemy armored column before they even know they're being engaged. The emphasis on electronic warfare and morale means a unit doesn't have to be destroyed to be rendered useless on the battlefield. It requires a heavy tactical mindset, and the interface is aggressively dense, but hardcore wargamers picking this up for $15.99 are getting an incredibly refined simulation of a 1989 conflict that never happened. Sins of a Solar Empire II. The celestial bodies actually move. Orbits constantly shift the physical layout of the solar system, meaning that impenetrable choke point you locked down an hour ago might slowly drift away, leaving your core worlds completely exposed. This single mechanic forces a highly dynamic approach to a massive space 4X experience. Managing capital ship positioning while maintaining a sprawling economic empire requires serious multitasking. It hasn't been out very long, so seeing a 25% cut, bringing it to $22.49, makes grabbing it right now an incredibly smart play. Total War III Kingdoms. The character relationship system fundamentally dictates how your empire functions. Your best generals might form deep rivalries, forcing you to separate them into different armies to prevent a catastrophic mutiny mid-campaign. The espionage mechanics are brutal, allowing you to embed a spy so deeply into an enemy faction they can eventually trigger a civil war from the inside. The UI is arguably the most gorgeous in the entire franchise. At $11.99, grabbing the most diplomatically complex entry in the series is an absolute bargain for your campaign budget. The Wandering Village. Your city foundation has its own mind. You're not just managing housing and food. You are cultivating a symbiotic relationship with the colossal beast carrying your civilization. If you harvest its spikes for stone, it loses trust in you and might ignore your commands to avoid a massive cloud of toxic spores on the world map. The hand-drawn art style masks a surprisingly tense survival management loop. Half price at $15.99 makes taking care of a giant wandering ecosystem incredibly tempting. Tempest Rising. Nailing the exact pacing and asymmetrical faction design of classic Golden Era strategy is remarkably difficult, but the explosive combat loops here feel instantly familiar. Managing distinct power grids while teching up to wildly exaggerated superweapons hits a very specific nostalgic nerve. The campy narrative tone and distinct faction philosophies prioritize aggressive map control over passive turtling. At $27.99, it sits at a slightly higher price point during the sale, but for anyone who grew up command-clicking entire screens of heavy armor, the mechanical execution is undeniably sharp. Aliens: Dark Descent. You command your entire squad as a single fluid unit, focusing on tactical positioning and suppression rather than micromanaging individual shots. The true terror comes from the persistent stress system. If a Marine barely survives a xenomorph hunt, they return to base with permanent psychological trauma that actively degrades their performance in the next deployment. It's punishing. The tutorial barely scratches the surface, but paying $11.99 for an experience that genuinely respects the dread of the license is a phenomenal deal. Northgard Definitive Edition. Expanding your territory requires careful planning because every new zone drains your resources faster. When the harsh winter hits, your food production plummets and your wood consumption skyrockets. If you spent the autumn building an army instead of chopping firewood, your entire clan will freeze to death in a matter of minutes. The map conditions constantly shift, forcing rapid strategic pivots. Snagging the Definitive Edition, packed with refined clans and mechanics, under $10 guarantees incredible mileage for the price. Dune, Spice Wars. Political assassinations and stock market manipulation are just as viable as fielding a massive standing army. The pacing sits somewhere between a traditional real-time strategy and a methodical board game. You have to constantly monitor the desert because the vibration of your own military engagements will inevitably attract a sandworm that wipes out both sides of the conflict. The constant tension of paying the imperial spice tax keeps the pressure high. For $13.99, mastering the brutal espionage economy of Arrakis is highly recommended. Starship Troopers Terran Command. True line-of-sight management is the only thing keeping your squads alive. If you place a heavy machine gun unit behind a group of riflemen, they won't fire for fear of hitting their own comrades. Positioning units on varied elevations to create overlapping fields of fire turns every canyon into a desperate puzzle of survival against endless hordes. The unit pathing can sometimes be a bit finicky on tight corners, but holding the line for $17.99 captures the desperate satirical meat grinder of the movies. Homeworld III. Using physical terrain in a space setting completely rewrites how you engage enemy fleets. Hiding a squadron of bombers behind a massive floating piece of derelict machinery to ambush an enemy cruiser feels incredibly satisfying. The audio design alone, with radio chatter shifting dynamically based on combat.
Obtain safe passage home. Reach Vladivostok on an armored train. Command Czechoslovak soldiers stranded in a hostile land. Explore war-torn cities and the Siberian countryside. Deploy squads from the train to explore the surrounding area. Lead your soldiers in real-time tactical battles.